The Miller family farm stretches across 200 acres of prime agricultural land that has been in my family for 6 generations. My great-great-grandfather Thomas Miller settled this valley in 1887, building the farmhouse where I now stand with his own hands. Every corner of this property holds memories. The old oak tree where my father taught me to identify bird calls, the creek where I caught my first fish, the fields where I learned to drive a tractor before I could reach the pedals properly. When my parents urged me to attend college rather than immediately taking over the farm, I reluctantly agreed. The soil of this place was in my blood, but I understood their wisdom in wanting me to experience the wider world. I left for the University of Chicago with a promise that I would return someday. My agricultural business degree led to an unexpected career in commercial real estate development. The irony was not lost on me that I helped create the very suburbs that were slowly eating away at America's farmland. For 20 years, I built a reputation as a fair and ethical developer, someone who understood both the importance of progress and the value of preservation. My specialty became creating mixed-use developments that incorporated green spaces and agricultural elements. My colleagues often joked that I could never fully leave the farm behind, even while designing luxury condominiums in Boston and Seattle. The call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. My father had suffered a massive heart attack while working in the fields. My mother, attempting to reach him on their old ATV, had crashed in her panic. Neither survived. The dual funeral was attended by nearly everyone in the county, a testament to how beloved my parents were in the community. As I stood by their graves, I renewed my childhood promise. It was time to come home. The farm had been well maintained, thanks to the dedicated work of Earl Jenkins, our farm manager of 30 years. But I noticed changes to the surrounding landscape immediately. What had once been the Matthews Dairy Farm adjacent to our property now contained rows of large, nearly identical homes with manicured lawns and ornate entrance gates. The sign read Meadowbrook Estates, Luxury Country Living. Earl filled me in as we inspected the property boundaries. They broke ground about 3 years ago. Your father was not happy about it, but the Matthews family had financial troubles and sold to developers. The houses started at $500,000. Different kind of folks moving in than we are used to around here. I nodded, watching a woman in designer exercise clothes walk a tiny dog along the perimeter road that separated our properties. She glanced at our weathered barn with visible distaste before hurrying past. That was my first glimpse of what would become an increasingly hostile boundary line. Determined to be a good neighbor despite our obvious differences, I attended the Meadowbrook Estates community barbecue the following weekend. I brought baskets of fresh produce from our early summer crops, a gesture my mother would have insisted upon. Some residents received the gifts warmly, curious about the farm and its history. Others barely disguised their contempt for what they clearly viewed as a primitive occupation. Patricia Montgomery, the HOA president, accepted my tomatoes with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "How quaint. We are so pleased you could join us. I do hope you will be making some updates to your property now that you have returned. The aesthetic appeal of neighboring properties affects all our home values, you understand." I maintained my politeness, explaining that the working farm had been operating successfully long before their subdivision existed. "I think there is room for both of us in this valley. Different lifestyles can coexist with mutual respect." As I left the gathering, I overheard Patricia speaking to another board member. "Something must be done about that eyesore. Property values will plummet if prospective buyers see that ancient farmhouse from the north side lots." I drove home with an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The farm was not just my livelihood but my heritage, a living museum of my family's history. I had no intention of altering it to suit suburban sensibilities. Little did I know then how quickly this cultural clash would escalate into all-out warfare. 3 weeks after my return, I found an official-looking letter fastened to my front gate with zip ties. The letterhead displayed Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association in elegant script, followed by a list of board members and their credentials. The message was less elegant, a formal complaint about unsightly agricultural equipment visible from community roads and excessive noise from farming operations during residential quiet hours. I read the letter twice, convinced it must be some kind of joke. The farm equipment in question, a tractor and harvester, were parked exactly where they had been parked for decades, well within the boundaries of my property. The excessive noise referred to was Earl starting up the irrigation system at dawn, a necessary task during the hot summer months. I drafted a polite but firm response explaining that my property was not part of their homeowners association and therefore not subject to their rules and restrictions. I included copies of the original property records dating back to my great-great-grandfather's purchase, highlighting the clear boundaries. Rather than mail this information, I decided to deliver it personally, hoping to establish a respectful dialogue. The Meadowbrook Estates clubhouse was an imposing structure of stone and glass, designed to resemble a country manor while incorporating every modern luxury. The receptionist directed me to a small office where Patricia Montgomery sat behind an immaculate desk, not a paper out of place. "Mrs. Montgomery, I wanted to address the notice I received," I began, placing my documents on her desk. "While I appreciate your concern for your community's appearance, my farm is a separate property with its own historical boundaries. We are not part of Meadowbrook Estates and not subject to HOA regulations." Patricia barely glanced at the documents before pushing them back toward me. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "Mr. Miller, rules exist for a reason. Every property in this vicinity affects the others. Your activities are diminishing the premium living experience our residents have paid for. Surely you understand basic property economics with your background." "I understand property law, Mrs. Montgomery. The farm predates your development by over a century. We have established agricultural use rights that supersede any HOA regulations." She stood, smoothing her immaculate blazer. "Let me be direct, Mr. Miller. Times change. Progress happens. Your farm is an anachronism that impacts our community negatively. The board is prepared to work with you on a reasonable timeline for bringing your property into compliance, but compliance will be expected." "There is nothing to comply with," I responded, working to keep my voice level. "My property is not under your jurisdiction. I came here as a courtesy, but I will not be altering my legitimate agricultural operations." Her smile disappeared entirely. "We will see about that. The board has resources and connections you might not anticipate. It would be wiser to cooperate now than face difficulties later." The implied threat hung in the air between us as I gathered my documents and left. The next month brought a steady stream of complaint letters, each more aggressive than the last. I began documenting everything, photographing the letters, recording dates and times of what I now recognized as deliberate harassment. I noticed unfamiliar cars driving slowly past the farmhouse, passengers openly taking photos of my property. When I approached one such vehicle, it sped away, but not before I recognized one of the HOA board members in the passenger seat. The final straw came when I discovered someone had removed the historic Miller Farm Est 1887 sign from my front gate. That sign had been hand-carved by my grandfather and had stood for over 70 years. I immediately reported the theft to the local sheriff's department, but Deputy Collins seemed reluctant to pursue the matter. "Probably just kids playing pranks," he suggested, though we both knew better. The following week, I received a formal invitation to attend the monthly HOA meeting as a courtesy to neighboring property owners. Determined to clear the air once and for all, I prepared a brief presentation about the farm's historical significance and legal standing in the community. The meeting room fell silent when I entered. Approximately 30 residents were seated in neat rows, with the board members at a long table facing them. Patricia nodded curtly toward an empty chair in the front row, clearly not expecting me to speak. When the agenda item, neighboring property compliance issues, arose, I raised my hand to address the group. Patricia attempted to continue without acknowledging me, but several residents pointed in my direction, forcing her to reluctantly give me the floor. "Thank you for inviting me tonight," I began. "I understand there are concerns about my farm, and I wanted to address them directly. The Miller farm has operated continuously since 1887. I had barely finished my introduction when Patricia interrupted. "Yes, yes, we all appreciate history, Mr. Miller, but we need to discuss the specific violations that have been documented." "There are no violations because my property is not part of your HOA," I said firmly. Board member Richard Thornton, a retired corporate attorney as he had mentioned several times, shuffled some papers importantly. "Actually, according to the county plan, in maps we have obtained, your property falls within the designated Community Improvement District that includes Meadowbrook Estates." He held up a map that indeed showed my farm shaded in the same color as the subdivision. I stepped forward to examine it more closely, immediately noticing the discrepancy. "This is not the official county record," I stated. "The boundaries have been altered. My property line extends to Oak Creek Road, not Meadowbrook Lane as shown here." Patricia waved dismissively. "These are the most current plans as approved by the County Planning Commission." I left the meeting determined to verify the official records. The next morning at the county clerk's office, my suspicions were confirmed. Someone had indeed submitted updated planning maps that gradually expanded Meadowbrook's jurisdiction to encompass portions of my land. The changes had been made incrementally over 3 years, each alteration small enough not to trigger verification requirements. My parents, focused on maintaining the farm in their advancing years, had likely never noticed the quiet encroachment on paper. As I drove home, the reality of what I was facing became clear. This was not a simple neighborhood dispute. The HOA was systematically attempting to seize control of land that had been in my family for generations. Their tactic was as brilliant as it was underhanded: death by 1,000 paper cuts, using bureaucracy as a weapon. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and I would need to fight back with every resource at my disposal. The morning after the HOA meeting, I found an official violation notice attached to my mailbox. Unlike the previous letters, which had been formatted as complaints or requests, this document specified financial penalties: $500 for failure to remove non-conforming structures, and an additional $100 per day until the supposed violations were addressed. The structures in question were my grandmother's garden shed and the historic corn crib that had stood near the property line since the 1920s. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from Montgomery, Thornton and Associates, legal representatives, threatening legal action if I did not comply with HOA regulations within 30 days. The letter cited obscure county ordinances and included references to court cases that supposedly supported their position. The intimidation tactic was obvious: overwhelm me with legal language and hope I would capitulate without verifying their claims. I took the letter to James Harrington, a local attorney who had worked with my father on various matters over the years. James removed his reading glasses after reviewing the documents, his expression grim. "This is egregious overreach," he said, tapping the letter with his finger. "They are operating on the assumption that you will be intimidated by legal language or lack the resources to challenge them. The cases they cite are not applicable to your situation, and the county ordinances have been selectively quoted to misrepresent their actual meaning. So I am correct that they have no jurisdiction over my property?" I asked. "Absolutely correct. Your farm is zoned agricultural and protected under state law as a historic family farm operation. The boundary encroachment on those planning maps is highly suspicious and potentially fraudulent. I recommend we file a formal complaint with the county surveyor's office immediately." James helped me prepare the necessary documentation, but warned me that the wheels of bureaucracy turn slowly. "Meanwhile," he cautioned, "document everything. Any interaction with HOA members, any unusual activity near your property lines, anything that feels off." His advice proved prescient. The following weekend, I caught two men in polo shirts bearing the Meadowbrook Estates logo walking along my eastern field with measuring equipment. When confronted, they claimed to be assessing drainage issues that might affect community properties. I ordered them off my land and documented the encounter with photos and written notes of the date, time, and their statements. More disturbing incidents followed. Earl discovered a section of fence cut near the irrigation controls. Our primary water pump failed inspection due to apparent tampering with the electrical components. The lock on our equipment barn was found broken, though nothing valuable appeared to be missing. "This is getting serious," Earl commented as we repaired the fence. "These city folks do not understand that messing with a working farm is not just annoying. It threatens our livelihood and can create genuine hazards." I nodded grimly, recalling how my father had always emphasized that a farm was both a business and a carefully balanced ecosystem. Damaged irrigation could ruin crops. Broken fences could allow animals to escape or be injured. These were not mere inconveniences, but potentially devastating blows to our operatio. And the psychological toll began to wear on me. I found myself constantly scanning the property lines, jumping at unexpected sounds, checking and rechecking locks and equipment. The farm that had always been my place of peace had become a battleground, and the constant vigilance was exhausting. After the third incident of vandalism, tire tracks through a newly planted field, I invested in a comprehensive security camera system. The installation was expensive but necessary, covering the main buildings and property boundaries with motion-activated cameras that uploaded footage directly to cloud storage. The investment paid dividends almost immediately. Just 2 days after installation, the cameras captured 3 individuals trespassing near our storage buildings after midnight. The footage clearly showed Richard Thornton from the HOA board directing 2 younger men as they photographed and measured our structures. I immediately forwarded the footage to James and filed another report with the sheriff's department. Deputy Collins viewed the footage with obvious discomfort. "Look, Miller, I understand your frustration, but trespassing is a minor offense. The most we can do is issue warnings." "And if they were damaging property, cutting fences, tampering with equipment?" I pressed. He shifted uncomfortably. "You would need clear evidence linking specific individuals to those acts." His reluctance to take meaningful action confirmed my growing suspicion that local authorities were somehow connected to the HOA leadership. Whether through social relationships, political donations, or other means, Patricia Montgomery had managed to ensure that official channels would provide minimal resistance to her agenda. The final revelation came unexpectedly. A package arrived at my door containing architectural drawings and permit applications that had been mistakenly delivered to my old address and forwarded. As a former developer, I recognized construction plans immediately, and these showed a proposed access road cutting directly through the eastern portion of my farm, connecting Meadowbrook Estates to the main highway and effectively splitting my property in two. The application listed Montgomery Development Group as the principal entity and included signatures from county planning officials indicating preliminary approval. The date on the documents revealed they had been in process for months, even before my return to the farm. The most disturbing detail was a notation indicating the land in question had been secured through established Community Development District regulations. In other words, the HOA had been systematically laying groundwork to seize part of my land through bureaucratic manipulation, presenting it as already under their jurisdiction due to the altered planning maps. The road would increase property values for Meadowbrook residents by providing a more direct route to the highway while simultaneously crippling the farm's operations by dividing the contiguous acreage. The bold audacity of their plan staggered me. This was not just harassment but calculated theft disguised as community improvement. As I spread the documents across my kitchen table, my hands no longer trembled with anxiety but with rage. They had awakened something in me that went beyond protecting personal property. This was about defending my family's legacy against those who would destroy it for convenience and profit. I called James immediately. "They are planning to build a road through my farm," I explained, my voice tight with controlled anger. "I need to know every legal option available to stop this, and I need to know now." "This changes everything," James replied after I explained the details. "This is no longer a matter of nuisance complaints but attempted appropriation of private property. We need to request an emergency injunction." As I hung up the phone, I knew the conflict had entered a new phase. The HOA had made their move, confident in their ability to overwhelm me with legal and bureaucratic pressure. What they could not have anticipated was that their escalation would remove any reservation I might have had about fighting back with every resource at my disposal. The time for polite neighborly responses had ended. Now it was war. The mechanical growl of heavy engines shattered the pre-dawn silence. I jolted awake, momentarily disoriented before recognizing the distinctive sound of large machinery. A glance at the bedside clock showed 5:47 a.m. Construction equipment operating before 6 violated county noise ordinances, but that was the least of my concerns as I registered what must be happening. I threw on clothes and boots, grabbing my phone and the folder of property documents I had been keeping readily accessible. Through the bedroom window, I could see dust rising from the eastern field, golden in the early morning light. My heart pounded as I rushed outside, running toward the commotion. The scene that greeted me stole my breath. 3 massive yellow bulldozers were carving a wide path through my wheat field, the crops my father had planted before his death now crushed beneath metal treads. A construction trailer was positioned near the property line, with several pickup trucks parked alongside it. Workers in hard hats moved about with surveying equipment, acting as if this destruction was completely authorized and ordinary. "Stop! You need to stop immediately," I shouted, approaching the nearest bulldozer. The operator either could not hear me over the engine noise or chose to ignore my commands, continuing to push forward through the crops. I positioned myself directly in front of the machine, waving my arms. The bulldozer lurched to a halt, its engine idling loudly. The operator removed his hearing protection, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, you need to clear the construction zone. This is an active work site," he called down to me. "This is private property. You have no authorization to be here, much less destroy my crops," I responded, struggling to maintain my composure as I surveyed the damage already done. A swath approximately 50 feet wide had been cleared through nearly a quarter-mile of productive farmland. A man in a white hard hat approached, clipboard in hand and irritation evident in his stride. "Is there a problem here? We have a schedule to maintain." "The problem is you are trespassing and destroying private property," I stated firmly. "Who authorized this work?" He consulted his clipboard with exaggerated patience. "We have all necessary permits from the county for construction of Meadowbrook Community Access Road Phase 1. Notifications were sent to all affected property owners 30 days ago, as required by law." "I never received any notification, and I never granted permission for anyone to build a road through my farm," I countered, pulling out my phone to document the destruction. The foreman stepped between me and the bulldozer, blocking my camera view. "Sir, I understand you are upset, but the legal matters have been settled. We have authorized permits and are proceeding according to approved plans. If you have concerns, you need to take them up with the county planning office. Now, I must ask you to leave the construction zone for safety reasons." "I am not leaving my own property," I insisted. "Show me these permits you claim to have." Reluctantly, he produced a set of documents that indeed showed county approval stamps for the road construction. The permits listed Meadowbrook Community Development District as the property owner of record for the entire construction zone, a complete fabrication based on the altered planning maps. "These permits are based on fraudulent information," I explained, pointing to the property description. "This land has been in my family for generations. I have the original deeds and surveys that prove it." The foreman shrugged, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to halt operations. "Look, I just follow the work orders. If there is a dispute about ownership, that needs to be resolved through proper channels. We have valid permits and instructions to proceed." I stepped back and called the sheriff's department, demanding immediate assistance. While waiting, I photographed every aspect of the scene: the equipment, the permits, the destruction already caused, and the workers continuing to operate despite my objections. I also called James, briefly explaining the emergency situation. When Deputy Collins arrived 30 minutes later, the damage had extended significantly. He surveyed the scene with obvious discomfort, especially when he noticed several luxury vehicles now parked near the construction trailer. Patricia Montgomery stood with Richard Thornton and 2 other HOA board members, observing the proceedings with poorly concealed satisfaction. "These people are destroying my property without authorization," I explained to Collins, showing him my property documents. "The permits they are using list incorrect ownership information." Deputy Collins reviewed both sets of papers, frowning. "This is a complicated situation. The permits appear properly issued by the county." "Based on fraudulent information," I insisted. "The HOA has been systematically altering planning maps to make it appear that portions of my farm fall under their jurisdiction." Patricia approached, maintaining a careful distance from the disturbed soil that might soil her expensive shoes. "Deputy Collins, we have followed every legal requirement for this community improvement project. Mr. Miller is simply resistant to progress, as we have discussed previously. The implied familiarity between them confirmed my suspicions about local influence. Collins looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between obvious property destruction and official-looking documentation. "I cannot determine property boundaries in the field," he finally stopped. "Ted, however, given the dispute, I recommend construction be temporarily halted until ownership can be verified." Patricia's smile tightened. "That would cause significant delays and financial penalties for breach of contract with our construction firm. The county has already approved all aspects of this project." "I have the original property survey from when my great-grandfather expanded the farm in 1912, I countered, pulling the carefully preserved document from my folder. "And here is the most recent survey from when my father updated the property lines in 1998. Both clearly show that this entire area is Miller Farm property." Deputy Collins examined the surveys, then looked at the freshly bulldozed path with growing concern. The historical documentation was irrefutable, showing clear boundaries that had remained consistent for over a century. "Mrs. Montgomery, in light of this documentation, I must insist that construction be halted pending verification by the county surveyor's office," he stated formally. "Continuing could constitute willful destruction of private property, which would become a criminal rather than civil matter." Patricia's composure cracked momentarily, a flash of rage crossing her features before she regained control. "Very well. We will comply with the sheriff's request as good citizens, though this delay will be noted in our report to the county commissioners." The implied threat was clear, but Collins stood firm. He officially instructed the construction crew to cease operations and remove their equipment from the property. As the workers began powering down the bulldozers, I walked the length of the destruction with Earl, who had arrived during the confrontation. The damage was extensive, not just to the wheat crop, but to drainage systems and historic field boundaries that had been carefully maintained for generations. "Look there," Earl pointed toward the luxury SUVs parked at the edge of the property. Patricia and her board members were engaging in animated conversation, occasionally glancing in our direction. One woman was actually holding a champagne flute, as if celebrating their assault on my livelihood. "They are not even trying to hide their contempt," I observed quietly. "No, sir, they are not," Earl agreed. "But they made a critical mistake today. They moved from paper threats to physical destruction. That changes everything." He was right. Until now, the conflict had been waged through bureaucratic channels and intimidation tactics. By bringing bulldozers onto my land and destroying crops, they had crossed a line that could not be ignored or papered over with legal maneuvers. They had revealed the true extent of their arrogance and their belief that their wealth and connections made them untouchable. As I surveyed the ruin of my father's final planting, grief mingled with determination. This attack was not just on my property, but on my family's legacy and the generations of careful stewardship that had maintained this land. The HOA might have connections, money, and influence, but they had underestimated what they were truly fighting against. I pulled out my phone and began meticulously documenting the damage, every foot of destroyed crops, every disturbed boundary marker, every piece of equipment still sitting on my property. This evidence would be critical in the coming battle. As the sheriff departed with promises to expedite the surveyor's verification, I already knew my next steps would need to go far beyond conventional legal responses. "Earl," I said quietly, "I need you to manage things here for the rest of the day. I have important research to do." The old farm manager nodded knowingly. "Going to dig into the family archives?" "Yes, I have a feeling there might be resources there that, even my father never fully utilized. As I walked back toward the farmhouse, I felt Patricia's eyes following me with smug confidence. She believed she had dealt a devastating blow, even with the temporary construction halt. What she could not know was that her actions had not broken my spirit but had instead triggered a response she was entirely unprepared for. The bulldozers had awakened something that had lain dormant for generations, knowledge that would shift the balance of power in ways the HOA could never anticipate. The family office occupied the rear portion of our farmhouse, a room that had served as command center for the farm's operations since the building was constructed. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves containing records dating back to the property's founding. My father had been meticulous about preserving family documents, as had his father before him. I began with the oldest files, carefully examining yellowed papers and faded photographs that chronicled the Miller family's role in establishing the county. My great-grandfather Thomas Miller II had been particularly active in local government during the early 1900s, serving on various committees and boards during a period of rapid development. In the third filing cabinet, behind folders of tax records and correspondence, I found a leather portfolio embossed with the county seal. Inside were documents I had never seen before: land grants, mineral rights certificates, and legal agreements between Thomas Miller II and the county government dated 1905. As I read through the formal language of century-old legal documents, my breath caught. According to these papers, my great-grandfather had not only donated the land for the original county courthouse and administrative buildings, but had retained mineral and subsurface rights to vast tracts of land throughout the county, including the entire area where Meadowbrook Estates now stood. The agreement specified that while surface rights could be sold or transferred, the mineral rights would remain permanently with the Miller family in perpetuity. A separate document outlined special access and usage rights that accompanied these mineral claims, including the right to inspect, maintain, and potentially extract any valuable resources. I carefully photographed each document, then continued searching through the archives. In a separate file labeled County Affairs, I discovered correspondence between my grandfather and various county officials from the 1950s, acknowledging and reaffirming the family's subsurface rights during a period of infrastructure expansion. The most recent reference appeared in papers from 1978, when my father had permitted the county to install water lines across portions of our property, with explicit language stating this permission did not alter or diminish the family's underlying mineral rights throughout the region. I sat back in my father's old leather chair, the implications slowly crystallizing. The Miller family, which now meant me alone, technically owned the mineral rights beneath every property in Meadowbrook Estates. This included not just potential oil or gas deposits, but legally defined rights of access and usage that could potentially supersede certain surface owner privileges. This was not a weapon to be deployed lightly. I needed expert confirmation before proceeding. I called James and briefly explained my discovery, asking him to recommend a specialist in mineral rights and historical land claims. 2 days later, I sat in the office of Catherine Blackwood, one of the state's foremost experts on historical property rights. She examined the documents carefully, occasionally nodding or making notes. "These rights appear to be legally sound," she finally confirmed. "The language is clear and specific. The agreements were properly recorded with the county and state. There is no evidence they were ever transferred or terminated. So I have legitimate legal rights to the subsurface of all that land?" I asked. "Not just the subsurface, Mr. Miller. These particular mineral rights, as defined in the early 1900s, include significant surface access privileges and usage rights. Additionally, these documents establish what we call prior claim dominance, meaning your family's rights predate and therefore can take precedence over subsequent property divisions or zoning changes, including the creation of a homeowners association. Catherine smiled. Especially entities like homeowners associations, which have no standing to override mineral rights established by state-recognized agreements. Your great-grandfather was extremely thorough in protecting his family's interests. I left her office with detailed legal opinions and a strategy for asserting these long-dormant rights. The irony was not lost on me. The very legal system that Patricia Montgomery had tried to weaponize against me now offered a powerful shield and sword of my own. Back at the farm, I began researching the HOA board members themselves. Public records and social media provided a wealth of information about the people who had been systematically harassing me. Patricia Montgomery, I discovered, had a history of aggressive HOA leadership in 2 previous communities in other states, with multiple lawsuits filed against her boards for overreach and selective enforcement. Richard Thornton, despite his frequent references to his legal background, had actually been censured by the State Bar Association for ethics violations related to real estate transactions. 2 other board members owned property development companies that stood to benefit directly from the proposed access road through my farm. Their pattern was clear. They had used HOA positions as leverage to manipulate property values and development opportunities for personal gain, all while hiding behind community improvement rhetoric. My farm was simply their latest target, valuable because of its location and their ability to gradually encroach through bureaucratic maneuvering. Armed with both historical documents and current intelligence, I began contact in-county officials directly. My first call was to the county surveyor, requesting an emergency verification of property boundaries following the bulldozer incursion. The surveyor, an older gentleman named Harold Wilson, seemed unsurprised by my call. "I have been expecting to hear from you, Mr. Miller," he admitted. "There have been some irregularities in recent planning map submissions that concerned me, but I was unable to act without a formal complaint from an affected property owner." My second call was to County Commissioner Margaret Chen, who had worked with my father on agricultural preservation initiatives years earlier. After explaining the situation, I mentioned my discovery of the mineral rights documents. Her sharp intake of breath was audible over the phone. "Those rights were considered a historical footnote, Mr. Miller. No one has actively enforced them for decades." "They remain legally valid," I pointed out, "and I am prepared to exercise them fully if necessary to protect my property from hostile encroachment." "This will cause quite a stir," she warned. "The Meadowbrook development represents significant tax revenue for the county." "I understand that, Commissioner. I am not looking to disrupt legitimate development, but I will not stand by while my family's land is seized through manipulation of the very systems you oversee." After several similar conversations with key officials, I felt the ground shifting. The confident dismissal I had initially encountered was being replaced by cautious acknowledgement that the legal reality might not align with what the HOA had been presenting. Several officials expressed concern about the altered planning maps, distancing themselves from any knowledge of the changes. Meanwhile, Earl reported increased activity around the Meadowbrook clubhouse. Emergency board meetings, visits from attorneys, and a growing unease among residents who had noticed the bulldozers suddenly departing without explanation. I spent evenings organizing my evidence and planning my counteroffensive. The mineral rights would be my nuclear option, a last resort if conventional legal approaches failed. For now, I focused on documenting the physical damage to my property, the pattern of harassment, and the apparent collusion between HOA leadership and certain county officials. As I assembled these materials, a cold clarity settled over me. The HOA had chosen this fight, confident in their superior resources and connections. They had no idea that beneath the simple farmer they had targeted lay a sophisticated business professional with his own resources and connections. And now, an ancestral ace in the hole that would turn their assault into the worst miscalculation of their privileged lives. The time had come to step out of the defensive position they had forced me into. Tomorrow, I would begin my counterattack. The county courthouse stood as it had for over a century, a stately brick building with white columns and broad steps leading to heavy wooden doors. My great-grandfather had donated this very land for its construction, a fact recorded in the cornerstone but forgotten by most current residents. I climbed those steps carrying a leather briefcase containing documents that would shake the foundations of Meadowbrook Estates more effectively than any bulldozer. My first stop was the office of Judge Marion Hargrove, the senior civil court judge who had served the county for nearly 30 years. I had requested an emergency hearing regarding the destruction of my property, and Judge Hargrove had agreed to meet before regular court sessions began. "These are extraordinary allegations, Mr. Miller," she commented after reviewing the documentation of the bulldozer incident and the history of harassment. "You are essentially claiming that the Meadowbrook HOA has engaged in a systematic campaign to seize portions of your property through fraudulent means." "The evidence supports this conclusion, Your Honor," I replied, presenting the altered planning maps alongside the original surveys. "These progressive changes to official documents were made without my knowledge or consent, gradually erasing my property boundaries on paper to justify physical encroachment." Judge Hargrove studied the documents carefully, her expression growing more severe. "I have known your family for decades, Mr. Miller. Your father was a man of absolute integrity. These actions against your property are disturbing on multiple levels." She signed emergency injunctions prohibiting any further construction activity on or adjacent to my property, and ordered an immediate investigation into the altered planning documents. The official orders would be served to the HOA board members and construction company that afternoon. My next visit was to the county records office, where I formally registered the historical mineral rights documents that had remained dormant for decades. The clerk's eyes widened as she processed the paperwork. "These are extensive rights, Mr. Miller. They cover nearly a third of the county, including all the new developments east of the highway." "I am aware," I replied calmly. "Please ensure they are properly recorded in the current digital system. I will need certified copies for distribution to relevant parties." By noon, I had filed formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office regarding potential fraud in the Planning Commission submissions, and requested investigation into possible ethics violations by county officials who had approved the altered maps. The local newspaper and regional television station received press packages detailing the destruction of historic farmland and documented harassment by the Meadowbrook HOA. I emphasized the generational significance of the farm and included photographs of the bulldozed crops juxtaposed with images of the property throughout its 130-year history. The County Historical Society received my application for historic designation of the farm's original structures and fields, along with a substantial donation toward their preservation efforts. The society president, Dr. Alina Washington, immediately recognized the strategic value of this move. Once a property is under consideration for historic designation, any damage to it carries enhanced penalties, she explained. We should have approached your family about this years ago, given the farm's significance to local history. By mid-afternoon, certified letters were delivered to each HOA board member, formally notifying them of my mineral rights claims beneath their properties and requesting access for inspection as permitted under the original agreements. The letters specifically mentioned potential drilling sites for geological surveys directly adjacent to their homes. The county sheriff delivered the court injunctions to the Meadowbrook Clubhouse during the emergency board meeting Patricia had called upon receiving my mineral rights notification. According to Deputy Collins, who seemed to be enjoying this particular assignment, her face had turned whiter than copy paper as she read through the documents. The final step in my day's campaign was arranging for the county surveyor to conduct an official verification of my property boundaries the following morning, with representatives from state regulatory agencies present to witness the process. This would create an unimpeachable record of the actual property lines before any further disputes could arise. As evening approached, I received a call from Patricia Montgomery herself. Her typically commanding voice had acquired a noticeable tremor. "Mr. Miller, perhaps we should discuss these matters directly, rather than through such formal channels." "I believe formal channels are most appropriate given the circumstances, Mrs. Montgomery," I replied evenly. "Your organization has destroyed valuable crops, damaged historical property, and attempted to seize land through fraudulent means. These are not matters for casual conversation. There may have been misunderstandings regarding boundaries," she offered. "The board would be willing to compensate you for any inconvenience caused during the road planning process." Destruction of property goes beyond inconvenience, Mrs. Montgomery, as does fraud, trespassing, harassment, and conspiracy to deprive a property owner of their legal rights. These are potentially criminal matters. Her voice hardened. "You are making powerful enemies, Mr. Miller. Our residents include judges, state officials, and business leaders who will not appreciate your aggressive tactics." "I am simply defending what is mine, using the legal system you attempted to weaponize against me. As for powerful enemies, I suggest you research exactly who you chose to target before making further threats." The phone call ended abruptly. I knew Patricia would be consulting attorneys and attempting to mobilize her network of connections. What she did not yet fully comprehend was that her carefully constructed house of cards was already collapsing. The following morning, I arrived at the Meadowbrook Community Center for their hastily called emergency meeting. The room fell silent as I entered, followed by James, Catherine Blackwood, and two representatives from the State Land Management Office. Every seat was filled, with residents standing along the walls, their expressions ranging from confused to hostile. Patricia and the board members sat at the front table, flanked by three attorneys who whispered urgently among themselves. The table before them was covered with documents, undoubtedly my notices, the court injunctions, and hastily prepared counterarguments. Patricia attempted to maintain control, rapping her gavel sharply. "This emergency session will come to order. Mr. Miller has raised certain historical claims that the board's legal team is currently reviewing. We have invited him here as a courtesy to discuss these matters civilly." "Thank you for the invitation," I replied, approaching the podium. "However, I should clarify that I am not here to make claims but to exercise established legal rights and address criminal actions taken against my property." I connected my laptop to the room's projector and began a methodical presentation of evidence. The screen displayed before and after satellite images of the bulldozed fields, followed by the progression of altered planning maps showing how my property boundaries had been gradually erased over time. These changes were submitted to the county by representatives of this board, I explained, displaying the signature pages. Each alteration was minor enough to avoid triggering verification requirements, but collectively, they created a fictional jurisdiction over portions of my farm. Murmurs spread through the assembled residents. Many appeared genuinely shocked by what they were seeing. I continued by displaying the construction permits based on the fraudulent boundaries, alongside photographs of the actual destruction caused. This was not a paperwork error or boundary dispute, I stated firmly. This was a deliberate campaign to seize valuable property through manipulation of public records, followed by physical destruction when I refused to comply with illegitimate demands. One of the HOA attorneys interrupted. These are serious accusations that will require substantial legal review. In the meantime, the Access Road project represents a significant community improvement that benefits all local property values. The road project is permanently suspended by court order, I replied, displaying Judge Hargrove's injunction on the screen. Additionally, all properties within Meadowbrook Estates are now subject to my family's mineral rights claims, which predate your development by nearly a century. The attorney paled visibly. Those rights have been dormant for generations. They cannot suddenly be activated to obstruct legitimate development. Catherine Blackwood stepped forward, her expertise lending weight to her words. Mineral rights do not expire through dormancy under state law. The Miller family has maintained clear title to these rights continuously since 1905, and they are now choosing to exercise the access and usage provisions included in the original grants. I displayed a map of the subdivision with my mineral rights clearly outlined, covering the entire development and extending far beyond it. The implications became clear to everyone in the room. Their homes sat on land where I controlled the subsurface rights and significant access privileges. Let me be perfectly clear, I stated, facing the residents directly. My dispute is not with individual homeowners who purchased properties in good faith. My issue is with board members who orchestrated a campaign of harassment and illegal encroachment against my farm, culminating in the destruction of crops and historical structures. I turned to address Patricia and her board directly. You deployed bulldozers to destroy my property based on fraudulent documents. You had no idea that my family not only owns the farm you targeted, but holds legal rights to the land beneath your entire community. Those rights are now being fully exercised as a direct result of your actions. The room erupted in angry questions directed at the board. Residents demanded explanations about potential impacts to their properties and home values. Patricia attempted to restore order, but her authority had evaporated in the face of the evidence presented. Richard Thornton leaned forward to speak into his microphone. The board acted in the best interests of the community to improve access and property values. Any procedural irregularities were administrative oversights, not deliberate fraud. Administrative oversights do not include bulldozing crops at dawn based on permits obtained through altered property records, I countered. Nor do they include months of documented harassment and trespassing by board members. An older gentleman in the back raised his hand. I bought my retirement home here last year. Are you saying our properties are now subject to mineral extraction or drilling? That is precisely what I am saying, I confirmed. Under the terms of the original mineral rights agreements, I have the legal authority to conduct geological surveys and potentially extract resources from beneath your properties, with reasonable surface access rights included. The room exploded into chaos. Board members huddled with their attorneys while residents shouted questions and accusations. I waited calmly for order to be restored. When Patricia finally managed to quiet the crowd, I continued. However, I am prepared to offer a resolution that would benefit this community, while protecting my family's farm from further encroachment. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the room focused intently on what I would say next. I am willing to negotiate a limited waiver of active mineral rights enforcement within Meadowbrook Estates, with certain non-negotiable conditions. I outlined my terms clearly. Immediate resignation of the current board members who had orchestrated the harassment campaign, full financial compensation for all property damage, formal recognition of my farm's boundaries and historical status, and binding legal agreements preventing any future attempts to encroach on my property. Additionally, I require the subdivision to establish a permanent agricultural buffer zone, respecting the historic boundaries of the farm, with conservation easements preventing future development that would impact the farm's operations. As I concluded my presentation, the residents began directing their anger where it belonged, at the board members who had exposed their community to significant legal and financial jeopardy through their actions against my property. Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "You cannot hold an entire community hostage over a boundary dispute," she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "This was never a boundary dispute, Mrs. Montgomery," I replied calmly. "The boundaries have been clear for over a century. This was a calculated attempt to seize land that did not belong to you, using methods that may well result in criminal charges. I am offering a path forward that protects innocent homeowners from the consequences of your actions." As I gathered my materials to leave, I addressed the residents one final time. "Your board gambled with your property values and community stability when they targeted my farm. I suggest you select new leadership with a better understanding of property rights and legal boundaries. My attorneys will be available to discuss settlement terms once that change has occurred." Walking out of that meeting, I felt no triumph or satisfaction, only a deep resolve to restore what had been damaged and prevent further destruction. The HOA had deployed bulldozers believing they could simply overrun a simple farmer. They had no idea they were attacking not just my property but my heritage, a legacy that gave me legal authority over the very ground beneath their feet. The weeks following my confrontation with the HOA board unfolded with remarkable speed. Within 48 hours, Patricia Montgomery and 3 other board members submitted their resignations, effective immediately. The remaining members, who had played minor roles in the harassment campaign, issued a formal public apology for the unauthorized actions taken against the historic Miller farm. Settlement negotiations began with the HOA's insurance representatives and newly hired legal team. Their initial offers were predictably inadequate, but they quickly adjusted their position when Catherine presented detailed assessments of potential damages if I fully exercised my mineral rights or pursued fraud claims against individual board members. The final settlement agreement included substantial financial compensation for crop destruction, property damage, and legal expenses. More importantly, it established legally binding protections for the farm's historical boundaries and operations, including strict limitations on noise complaints related to normal agricultural activities and permanent easements preventing development within 100 yards of the property line. The county commissioners unanimously approved a resolution acknowledging the historical significance of the Miller farm and initiating the process for state-level historic site designation. The fraudulent planning maps were officially corrected, with new digital and physical records establishing the accurate boundaries in permanent form. Criminal investigations into the document alterations continued, with the county prosecutor focusing on Patricia Montgomery and Richard Thornton. They faced potential charges for fraud, falsification of public records, and criminal trespass, though their attorneys were working diligently to negotiate plea agreements that would avoid jail time in exchange for full cooperation. The media coverage generated unexpected benefits. Agricultural preservation groups contacted me about using the case as an example of the legal protections available to historic family farms. Several neighboring farmers reached out to share similar experiences with development pressure and encroachment, forming an informal alliance to protect their properties. The most surprising development came from within Meadowbrook Estates itself. The newly elected HOA board, led by residents who had opposed Patricia's aggressive tactics, proposed a community partnership focused on agricultural education and preservation. They suggested converting the disputed Eastern Buffer Zone into a community garden and educational space where residents could learn about the area's farming heritage. Many of us moved here because we value the rural character of this region, explained the new board president, Michael Sanchez. We never wanted to destroy that character. We wanted to be part of it. The previous board misunderstood and misrepresented our community's values. As spring arrived, the physical restoration of the damaged fields began. The settlement funds covered new irrigation systems and soil remediation, where the bulldozers had compacted the earth. Earl supervised the work with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring everything was restored to proper agricultural standards. To my surprise, volunteers from Meadowbrook Estates began appearing on weekends, offering to help with the restoration work. Families with children came to learn about farming and contribute to rebuilding what had been damaged. Former adversaries became allies in preserving the agricultural heritage that defined our community. Not everyone embraced the new relationship. Some residents, particularly those closest to Patricia's inner circle, remained hostile and resentful. They complained about the settlement terms and continued to view the farm as an obstacle to what they considered progress. However, they were now a visible minority whose complaints fell on increasingly unsympathetic ears. On a warm Saturday in May, almost a year after the bulldozer incident, we held a community celebration marking the official historic designation of the Miller farm. Tables laden with food stretched across the front yard, with many dishes prepared by Meadowbrook residents using vegetables grown in the new community garden. County Commissioner Chen presented the official historic site designation, permanently protecting the farm from future development pressure. This property represents not just agricultural heritage, but the foundation of our county's history, she declared. The Miller family has been stewards of this land for 6 generations, and today we ensure that stewardship can continue uninterrupted. In a particularly satisfying moment, I watched as Patricia's former mansion at the edge of the subdivision displayed a for sale sign. The rumor was that she could not bear the community's changed attitude toward her, or the constant reminder of her failed power play. Richard Thornton had already relocated to another state, his legal career effectively ended by the ethics violations stemming from the case. As the celebration continued into the evening, I found a quiet moment to visit my parents' graves in the small family cemetery at the western edge of the property. The setting sun cast long shadows across the headstones dating back to my great-great-grandfather. We protected it, I said quietly. The farm is safe now, probably safer than it has been in generations. The evening breeze rustled through the nearby oak trees, which had stood witness to the farm's entire history. The final piece of the restoration came the following week when I signed the papers establishing an agricultural heritage easement for the entire property. This legal instrument would permanently protect the land from development, ensuring it would remain agricultural, even if future generations of my family chose not to farm it themselves. The easement included specific provisions allowing for the community educational programs that had begun to flourish along the border between the farm and subdivision. Children from Meadowbrook now visited regularly to learn about growing food and caring for the land, lessons that would have been impossible had the HOA succeeded in their plans. As I walked the restored eastern field, now green with new growth, I reflected on the unexpected journey of the past year. What began as a defense of my property had transformed into something more significant: the protection of a heritage and the building of new connections between urban and rural neighbors who had previously viewed each other with suspicion. The HOA had deployed bulldozers believing they could simply overrun what they saw as an outdated relic standing in the way of progress. They had no idea that the simple farmer they targeted owned not just the land they attacked, but the legal rights to the ground beneath their entire community. More importantly, they failed to understand that true progress comes not from erasing history, but from honoring it while moving forward together. The farm would continue as it had for generations, adapting to changing times while maintaining its essential character. And now, it would do so with the protection of both modern legal instruments and a community that had learned to value its presence rather than view it as an obstacle to be removed. That evening, as I sat on the porch my grandfather had built, watching the sunset over fields my family had tended for over a century, I felt a deep sense of completion. The battle had been difficult and at times bitter, but the victory was not just for me or even for my family's legacy. It was a victory for the idea that the past and present could coexist, that progress did not require destroying history, and that even the most powerful adversaries could be overcome when you stood on solid ground, especially when you own the mineral rights beneath their feet.